Imagine turning on your phone and hearing something so shocking, so disturbing, that it stops you in your tracks. A police officer, someone sworn to serve and protect, caught on tape, ranting about a so-called race war, spewing hate without a second thought. This isn't a scene from a movie. This is real life. And it happened in North Carolina. What you're about to hear isn't just offensive, it's dangerous. It's the kind of talk that reveals an ugly truth hiding beneath the surface. These aren't just words. They reflect a mindset, a deep-rooted problem that doesn't go away just because it's uncomfortable to talk about. And the most chilling part, this officer wasn't alone. When the recording surfaced, it sent shockwaves through the community. People were outraged, but they were also afraid. Because if this is what's being said behind closed doors, what does it mean for the people these officers are supposed to protect? What does it mean for the trust between police and the communities they serve? Tonight, we're breaking it all down. Who are these officers? How did this recording come to light? And most importantly, what happens now? Because it's not just about one conversation. It's about a system, a culture, and a reckoning that's long overdue. Stay with us because what you're about to hear might change the way you see everything. The recording came from inside a patrol car where officers were talking freely, never thinking their words would be heard outside their circle. But someone did hear them. And once the audio was leaked, there was no way to ignore it. The voices on the tape weren't just making offhand remarks. They were filled with anger, with hate, with a dangerous kind of certainty. The kind that makes people feel invincible, untouchable. For people in the community, it wasn't just about what was said. It was about what it meant. If these officers talked like this when they thought no one was listening, how were they acting on the job? How many times had they pulled someone over with this mindset? How many people had been treated unfairly without even realizing the reason why? The questions started piling up, and the answers weren't coming fast enough. The department moved quickly to do damage control. Statements were made, apologies were issued, and officials promised an investigation. But for many, it felt like they had heard it all before. Words were easy, actions were harder, and the biggest question remained: how deep did this go? Were these just a few bad officers, or was this just the first crack in something much bigger? As the pressure mounted, people wanted to know more. Who recorded the conversation? Was it another officer, someone who had finally had enough? Or was it a citizen, someone who had gotten lucky, or unlucky, enough to capture the truth by accident? The person who exposed this didn't just leak a tape. They opened a door. And once it was open, there was no closing it. The city was on edge. Protests started forming, people demanding justice, demanding change. And in the middle of it all, the officers at the center of the controversy remained silent. No public statements, no explanations. Just the weight of their words hanging in the air, impossible to take back. But here's the real question: what happens next? Will these officers face real consequences, or will this story fade like so many before it? Will the system finally be forced to change, or will it find a way to protect itself once again? There's more to this story, and we're not done yet. Because when something this big comes to light, you have to ask, how much more is still hiding in the dark? As the recording spread, the city's response grew louder. What started as shock quickly turned into anger, then into action. Community leaders called emergency meetings, demanding answers from officials who suddenly found themselves in the hot seat. Some officers in the department distanced themselves from the controversy, insisting this was not a reflection of the entire force. But others stayed quiet, their silence speaking louder than words. Meanwhile, people on the streets weren't just talking, they were digging. Residents started coming forward with stories of past encounters, moments they had brushed off but now saw it in a different light. A man recounted the time he was pulled over for no clear reason, questioned aggressively, then let go without explanation. A woman shared how her son had been stopped while walking home, frisked, and told to watch himself without cause. Suddenly, the tape wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a confirmation of something people had felt for years but couldn't prove. At the heart of it all was a bigger question. How deep did this problem go? Was this just a few officers caught saying the quiet part out loud? Or was this just a glimpse into a culture that had been festering beneath the surface for decades? Some city officials insisted it was a one-time incident, a handful of bad apples who didn't represent the whole. But for the people who had lived through these experiences, that answer wasn't good enough. Even within the department, there were fractures. Some officers felt betrayed, angry that their colleagues had put them all under scrutiny. Others, though, struggled with something deeper, because they had heard comments like this before. Maybe not as blatant, maybe not caught on tape, but the same attitude. The same underlying belief that some people mattered less. And now, with the world watching, they had to ask themselves, had they stayed quiet for too long? Meanwhile, pressure was mounting from all sides. The mayor, the police chief, and city officials were scrambling to control the damage. Would these officers be fired? Could they be charged with anything? And even if they were removed, would that really fix anything? The protests were growing, the voices getting louder. And in the midst of it all, one lingering question refused to go away. If this is what was caught on tape, how much worse was happening where no one was listening? The city felt like it was on the edge of something big, something about to break. The protests weren't just growing, they were becoming impossible to ignore. What started as a few voices outside the police department had turned into crowds filling the streets, demanding accountability. Signs waved in the air, people chanted for justice, and the energy was thick with frustration and urgency. Inside City Hall, officials were in crisis mode. Pressure from the public was one thing, but now media outlets from across the country were picking up the story. News cameras followed every move, every statement, every hesitation. The police chief was facing tough questions. Why were these officers still on the force? Why did it take a leaked recording for action to be taken? And most importantly, what else was being hidden? Then another twist. A second recording surfaced. It wasn't just one conversation anymore. This new tape, leaked anonymously, had different voices, different officers. The same hateful rhetoric, the same dangerous talk. It wasn't an isolated incident. It was a pattern. And now the entire department was under scrutiny. Tensions boiled over. Protesters gathered outside the police headquarters, their chants shaking the building. People wanted resignations. They wanted real change, not just promises. And in the middle of it all, the officers at the center of the controversy remained silent, avoiding cameras, avoiding questions. But that silence couldn't last forever. Behind the scenes, investigations were ramping up. Lawyers got involved. City officials whispered about disciplinary action, even criminal charges. And as more pressure mounted, other officers started talking, some defending the department, others breaking ranks to admit that, yes, they had heard talk like this before. Some even admitted they had looked the other way. The mayor, who had tried to stay out of the fire, was now directly in it. Calls for a complete overhaul of the police force were growing. Trust in the system was collapsing. And then came the moment that changed everything. A closed-door meeting between city officials and law enforcement was about to determine what happened next. Would the officers be fired? Would charges be brought? Or would this all be swept under the rug? Outside that meeting, people were waiting. The protesters, the media, the entire city. Because whatever decision came next wasn't just about those officers. It was about whether real change was possible at all. And no one knew what was coming. As the closed-door meeting stretched on, tension outside continued to build. People were restless, waiting for answers, but then something no one expected happened. A former officer stepped forward. Not just any officer, but someone who had been with the department for years, someone who had been trusted. And he had something to say. In an unexpected press conference, this ex-officer stood before reporters, his face tense, his voice steady. He confirmed what many had feared. The recordings weren't an anomaly. This kind of talk had been happening for years, behind station walls, in locker rooms, even on duty. Officers who spoke up were ignored, sometimes even pushed out. And worse, he claimed, it wasn't just about words. Policies had been shaped by these attitudes, affecting real people, real cases. The crowd listening grew still, hanging on to every word. Inside the meeting, chaos erupted. The leaks were one thing, but now a former insider was blowing the whistle. City officials, already scrambling, realized the problem was bigger than just a few bad officers. It was systemic. The police chief, already under scrutiny, was now being accused of knowing about this behavior for years and doing nothing. If true, this wasn't just about firing a few officers. It could take down the leadership itself. The second recording had made it clear that multiple officers shared these views, but now the real question emerged. How many more were involved? How deep did this go? The city, already divided, now had even more reason to doubt its leaders. If the people in charge had ignored this for so long, what else had been overlooked? And if one former officer was willing to speak, were there others? Then another shockwave. More leaked documents surfaced, this time emails and internal messages, hinting that officials had known about the recordings long before they became public. That meant the delay in action wasn't just incompetence, it was intentional. They had tried to keep it quiet, and now they were caught. The mayor, the police chief, the entire leadership, suddenly they weren't just trying to control a scandal. They were fighting to save their own careers. Outside, the protests turned into something more. Calls for resignations, demands for a full investigation into the entire department. And the biggest question still remained unanswered. If this was only coming to light now, after so many years, what else was still buried in the dark? The pressure was unbearable. The city was boiling over, and the closed-door meeting could no longer hold back the inevitable. When officials finally emerged, their faces were tense, their words carefully chosen. The officers on the tapes were being fired, the police chief was stepping down, and an independent investigation was being launched into the entire department. It sounded like accountability, but the people weren't celebrating yet. They had heard promises before. The protests didn't stop. The resignations weren't enough. The leaked documents had made it clear that this wasn't just about a few officers. It was about an entire system that had protected them. People wanted real change, not just a handful of high-profile firings. And then, just when the city thought it had reached its breaking point, another bombshell dropped. A third recording, and this time it wasn't from years ago, it was recent. Recorded after the scandal had already exploded, after the officers had been exposed. In this tape, unnamed officers were caught mocking the outrage, dismissing the backlash as just another story that would blow over. They laughed about the firings, confident that they would be protected in the end. It was proof that, despite everything, some within the department still believed they were untouchable. The city erupted. This wasn't just about past corruption. This was happening in real time. The mayor was forced to act fast. The entire department was now under federal review. Officers were being suspended left and right. And for the first time, People felt like something bigger might actually be shifting. Not just empty words, but real consequences. But then, an unexpected twist, one that changed everything again. The person who leaked the third tape, it wasn't a whistleblower from outside the department. It wasn't a protester. It was an active duty officer, one who had had enough. And they weren't alone. A small group of officers had come forward, willing to expose what had been happening behind closed doors for years. It was a turning point, proof that change wasn't just coming from outside pressure, but from within. Not everyone in uniform was willing to stay silent anymore. The fight wasn't over, but something was different now. The shield of silence had cracked. And once that happened, there was no going back. The city had reached a turning point. What started as a single leaked recording had unraveled into something much bigger, a reckoning that could no longer be ignored. With officers coming forward from within the department, the truth wasn't just being exposed. It was being documented, piece by piece, in a way that couldn't be dismissed. The investigation expanded, uncovering patterns of behavior that had gone unchecked for years. And now those in power were finally being forced to answer for it. As more officers were suspended and internal reviews deepened, the community's demands for justice didn't fade. People kept pushing for policy changes, for independent oversight, for a system that didn't just punish bad behavior when it got caught, but prevented it from happening in the first place. The city announced plans for reform, promising more accountability, but trust wasn't going to be rebuilt overnight. The scars ran too deep for quick fixes. The protests slowly shifted from outrage to action. Community leaders met with officials, pushing for real commitments rather than empty words. The officers who had spoken out were now under both scrutiny and protection, hailed as heroes by some, seen as traitors by others. But one thing was clear. The silence that had once allowed things to continue unchecked had been broken. And that alone was something that couldn't be undone. As the dust settled, the city found itself at a crossroads. The firings, the resignations, the investigations, they were all steps forward, but they weren't the end of the story. The deeper question remained. Would this be the moment things truly changed? Or just another chapter in a cycle that kept repeating itself? Only time would tell. But for now, one thing was certain. The truth had come out. And once it was in the open, there was no pretending it had never been there in the first place.